Hi everyone, my name is Nick, and this week's plant of the week is Hoya macrophylla Albo-Marginata, also referred to as Hoya macrophylla variegata, or simply the variegated Hoya macrophylla. The species macrophylla in Latin translating to large leaved, which you can see these leaves on this Hoya are much larger than many of the other Hoyas that we are familiar with. Definitely has the largest leaves of all of the Hoyas that are more common on the market, which this is absolutely a Hoya that you can walk into most houseplant stores and you're going to find it in stock, which is fantastic because just a couple years ago, it wasn't quite that way. But these leaves, along with their large beautifulness, have a wonderful cream variegation that goes around the perimeter of the leaf, and also this really stunning kind of enigmatic veination along the leaves that's really quite lovely. It does have a lot of texture and a lot of little nuances that you'll notice the more that you look at these leaves. I've heard people say before that they find Hoya's leaves to be rather underwhelming, but if anybody says that these leaves aren't a work of art, they are lying to themselves. So this plant is native to Malaysia and Indonesia, and Hoyas across the board are commonly referred to as wax plants or wax flowers or porcelain flowers for not only these lovely thick waxy leaves that they sport, but also for the blooms that they get once they mature a little bit more. So they get these clusters of flowers that do have quite a waxy or porcelain appearance. They do kind of look a little bit fake, and it's kind of one of the most exciting things about Hoyas. As I said, a lot of people do find their foliage underwhelming, as I said, but the flowers are the star of the show. However, I do think that this Hoya in particular does have some really fantastic foliage. This Hoya macrophylla is going to thrive in some medium to bright light. It could even handle a little bit of direct sunlight, as these leaves are quite large, and since they are variegated, they can handle a little bit more sunlight. And if you do introduce them to some really bright sunlight, maybe say inside a west-facing window or in or around a south-facing window, you might start to notice that these plants get a really beautiful red blush to the leaves, as it's just kind of the leaves getting a little bit sun-stressed, or it's just handling that sun damage very, very well. And it does look quite beautiful, but this one I have here growing underneath a grow light in my bedroom in my whole plant shelf system, and it's absolutely been thriving. I've had this one for probably about 2 years, and it did take some time for it to start putting off some new growth, but now that I'm getting some nice big beautiful leaves, this plant is starting to fill out quite nicely. The watering for Hoyas is where you need to be a little bit more careful. They do not love a lot of water. As you can tell, this plant is very, very succulent and has some very, very thick stems. They're also a little bit woody, so you wouldn't want to overwater this plant. It would be very quick to start expelling some of these leaves and rotting away, or perhaps even rot completely if it suffers from root rot. So I'm watering my Hoya roughly like this one in a 6-inch terracotta planter, I think I'm probably watering it roughly every 8 to 10 days, but that's of course going to depend on how much light your plant is getting, and also depending on the soil. So when it comes to the soil, it's always very important to use a kind of in between what you would use for a houseplant mix or a succulent. I like to add some orchid bark and some perlite. Particularly the orchid bark is something that's really going to help out with these Hoyas, as they can grow epiphytically in nature, meaning that they aren't necessarily growing in soil, so they do handle situations of orchid bark and like sphagnum moss very well, things that you might consider growing a standard orchid in. But bare minimum, you can just go ahead and add a handful of perlite to the soil that you're planning on potting up your Hoya with, and that's going to be a much better idea than using that soil straight from the bag that's most likely peat based and just going to be a little too heavy and loamy for the Hoyas that do want to drain a little bit better. If you do go a little too far on the end of underwatering your Hoya, you will find your leaves begin to pucker a little bit. They will get a little wrinkly and they will get a little bit more give to them. Typically they are very, very succulent, but upon underwatering they will be able to be a little bit more pliable, let's say, and normally if I was going to bend this up, it would snap and break, but you might be able to get a little bit more flexibility in your leaves, which you could use my taco test if you're familiar to find out when to water your Hoya macrophylla. But often if your Hoyas are becoming a little puckered and wrinkly, it means you've gone a little too far on the end of watering. So I would try to beat your Hoya to that, but you do want to be mindful not to water it too much, as I said, as overwatering can be an issue. But if you are using a well-draining soil, as I mentioned, I'm pretty sure you're going to nip that problem in the bud. Hoyas are quite forgiving when it comes to the temperature. They're going to do best in the temperature range of 60 degrees to 85 degrees, which I'm sure many of us are already going to have readily going on in our homes. And you're going to fertilize these in the spring and summer. You don't need to be too harsh with the fertilizing of your Hoyas. They don't require a bunch, but after a year, of it being in the same planter and soil, I would go ahead and give it a light fertilizer. And I have been going around and doing what I've seen on the internet and heard from many of you guys is to use an orchid spray fertilizer and actually go around and spray the leaves and the stems of the plants. And I haven't really noticed an increase of growth from that myself, but I know that a lot of people swear by that. So I did, of course, want to share that with you guys today. Hoyas across the board are quite susceptible to mealybug. I haven't had as much of an issue with it with my Hoya macrophylla than I've had with some of my other Hoyas, but it's still something to be mindful of. But since these leaves are quite large and there really isn't that many crevices for it to hide in this plant, it's usually pretty easily taken care of. You can just use a standard insecticidal soap, or I'll go ahead and use like some alcohol and water and a little bit of soap, and then I'll just clean off the leaves there and rinse them off in the shower, and that'll take care of it. I do have a whole video on how I clean off my plants if you are curious there. And propagating your Hoyas, you're going to go ahead and propagate these from stem cuttings. You really only need to have one node. A node is where the leaf is going to meet the stem, but you're also going to notice along the stem that there are also plenty of little nubs and ridges that could also produce roots. So as long as you have one node, that's where you're going to get the new growth from, but it's always good to be maybe including some of this part of the stem that is going to have those little rootlets coming out. And you might see or hear about propagating Hoyas from just a single leaf. You can absolutely root a Hoya leaf, but I'm pretty sure 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, unless somebody makes a mistake and accidentally notches some of the node in there, it's not going to grow growth in the end. So I would avoid personally buying just a Hoya macrophylla leaf sitting in soil. I've seen that before, so I just want to make you wary of that. But yeah, stem cutting is the way you want to go, but if you are totally cool with just having a big old Hoya macrophylla leaf sticking out of the soil, that's totally fine by me. And while this plant is going to grow absolutely beautifully as a trailing plant, as I do have this beginning now, it's not really trailing, but you can see it's the beginning of a trailing plant. These look fabulous if you have them trellised. You can get a bamboo hoop or something a little bit more intricate, and you can start to let the vines start to explore their way around the bamboo or whatever you have. Any kind of trellis works, and this, with these large beautiful leaves, especially if they get some of that red hue to them, is really a beautiful show-stopping houseplant. So that's it for today's video, how to care for Hoya macrophylla Albo-Marginata. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I will see you guys in next week's episode of Plant of the Week. And if you don't already, follow me on Instagram at phillyfoliage, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.